Let's take a look at what we're going to be building. We have a full stack Nuxt application, which also connects to external services such as Stripe. We have a login system. Let's see that in action. So dude at dude.com, super secret password. And we can log in, log out. We can sign up for a premium membership that will be handled by Stripe. So we have an API connection to Stripe. So with that filled in, I can subscribe. Once the processing is complete, it will either be accepted or rejected, and then I will be sent back to, in this case, localhost. So now I've been sent back and it says the subscription was successful. I could then also manage my subscription. I don't need to do that right now. Also, then I would have access to videos, and we also have this forum where you can ask questions. We can search the questions. We can ask the questions. So how do you build a Nuxt app? And then I could answer the question. Watch this. So as a prerequisite, you're going to need to have Node installed on your local machine. Once you have Node set up, then you're ready to run npx nuxi init, and you can name your app whatever you like. We'll say yes here. And then we'll open that up in VS Code. Next, you want to run yarn. And then we want to run yarn dev. Then we can open up the app and we can see we have a working Nuxt application. We are ready to move on to installing Tailwind CSS. All right, just as I showed you in the dark mode video, we'll just install Tailwind CSS, and we're going to also install the color mode module from Nuxt. Once that's installed, we can add the modules Tailwind CSS and color mode to the Nuxt config, along with some Tailwind CSS properties. We'll create this assets Tailwind CSS file and in a moment. If we want dark mode to work, this color mode module, we're going to have to set the class suffix to an empty string. Now we can create that assets file. And inside that file, we just need 3 modules, the base, components, and utility. Next, we need to go back and create tailwindconfig.js. And inside of here, we will just create the Tailwind as normal. And the only extra thing here is the dark mode is set to class. Now we want to go to the app.view, and we want to replace this Nuxt welcome with a Nuxt layout, and nested inside of that, we have Nuxt page. Then we'll create a pages directory. Inside of that, we'll create an index.view. And inside of here, we just want to have a template. We want to say hello from pages. Once we have that, we can start with yarn dev. And we see hello from pages, so we know that that's working. Next, we'll create a layouts directory. Inside of that, we'll create a default layout. We will create a script. Notice the setup and language. Also, we will import a navbar, which we will build shortly. Then we'll add a template, a single div with the height of screen, that navbar component, and a slot. This slot will be filled with whatever this pages has. So that's nested inside of here. So whatever route we call, in this case index, will be added to this slot. So for the navbar, we'll copy here, components layout navbar, and we'll create that. All right, I pasted in a navbar so you don't have to see me type it. What you need to pay attention to here is we have a on click, we want to set the color theme, and we just use that color mode module to set the new theme. It's either light or dark, and we use a ternary operator here. You can see that in more detail in the dark mode video, but for now, we'll just assume that you'll pick some sort of navbar that you'd like. It doesn't need to be the exact same, just something with links. If you've seen one link, you've seen them all. Here's a Nuxt link. It just has a to and where you want to go. It's as simple as that, so we won't spend too much time on the navbar. We need to create this back button. It will be in the components element back button. Here it is. For the back button, you can make it look however you like. We just want something that has a click function on it, which calls router back. At this point, if you've been following along, you should have some sort of nav bar and a way to change from light to dark mode. In case you haven't seen the dark mode video, you add dark with a colon in front of it, and then once you change to dark mode, whatever is behind that colon will replace the normal class. Now seems like a great opportunity to add this all to some sort of Git repository. I've created mine already in GitHub. Once we've pushed that, this will be public by the time this goes live, and you'll be able to check out the README. I'll have a individual branch for each section of this tutorial. If you wanted to skip that section, you could check out section 1, initial setup and Tailwind install. You can see that here. If you check that out, then you are exactly where I am now, and you're ready to move on. At this point, we have a nav bar with links that lead to nowhere. So let's get started on making this thing fleshed out. We want to build a sign up first. So some sort of registration form. So what will that look like? We'll have a form in the browser. The user will send that form to the server. The server will verify and create a user, which will persist to the database. We'll also create a session and we'll attach the user to that session, which will be represented by a token. That token will then be sent to the browser to be saved as a cookie. And then whenever the browser refreshes, it will then go to the API, check to see that the cookie is valid. It will persist that user. If we go back to the browser, if we look in the cookies, we'll see here is an example cookie, and it's just the auth token. That cookie is what gets sent back to the API for verification each time. So then we have a persistent user even when they refresh. When they don't refresh, we'll be using state. When they're just using client-side navigation, there will be no need to hit the API every time. Inside of the pages directory, let's create a register.view. Just as before, I will paste in a form so you don't have to watch me type it. Let's go over that. We have a post register function, which will call a composable, use auth, and it will call the function register with email. And essentially, we are just going to pass on whatever values are typed into the form. We have our refs here. Each form value is vmodel binded to those refs. So we have a username, an email, and a password, and we have a button that will then submit that form. So now we can create this composable, use auth. We're going to need to add a TS to that. We will add a function to call the API, register with email. We'll surround it all in a try catch, and we will make a fetch request to the API auth register endpoint, and that will be a post request. In the body, we will send the values we got here as parameters. Then we will take whatever we get back and we will set the user state to that value, and then we will push to the dashboard. We need to make this session type here. So if we open up our types, we will add a session type. That type will have a user type on it. We will add that user type. Take a moment and pause if you need to, and you can add whatever you need to add on the user, whatever you would like. You don't really need this GitHub thing. We're not going to be using it in this tutorial. On that, we will have a subscription type. If you're not going to be doing subscriptions, obviously you could leave that off. Here is the subscription type. You could copy that as well. Let's go back. So now we'll need to import that. So now we have the session. Now we will need to actually create this API endpoint. We'll just copy this here. And as you may have seen in previous tutorials, it's quite easy to create API endpoints. We just create a server, and then we can add the rest of the path with a TS. And inside of here, we'll add a simple function just to see that it's working and that we have a connection to the API. We'll just say hello from the API. So what will we expect once we submit this form? It will hit this endpoint and then get this result, which will be hello from the API, and it will set the user to this result, and then it will push to the dashboard. So if we go to this sign up page, we should be able to submit the form and hit the API endpoint. Something doesn't agree here. Let's restart the server. Whenever you create API endpoints, sometimes just at random, sometimes you'll have a problem. Just reset the server and the problem goes away. So exactly what we expected. We were sent to the dashboard. Now let's see what the value is in the state. So if we go __nuxt.state.user, we see hello from the API. So now we have a connection made. Now let's actually register a user. For our MySQL database, we're going to be using Prisma JS, and we can install that by running yarn add prisma -- save dev. Once that's installed, we can run yarn add Prisma client. With those installed, we can go over to the server. In the server directory, we're going to create a database directory. And inside of this database directory, we're going to add a few files. I'll just add them here, and then I'll go over them one by one. First, we have our schema for Prisma, and we'll go over that in detail. We have the client, and it's just the Prisma JS client. Also, we're going to be using SQLite for the development of this app, and we're going to set that file to this file that we have here. And this is just an empty file. You just create the file. You don't need to put anything in it, and that will be used for the SQLite database. We have a user, and that user, we're going to have a default login type of email. If you're only planning on using email logins, you could leave that off. Also, we want to make sure that that email is unique and the username is unique. Other than that, if you're going to build the forum with me, then you want to have questions and answers. If you plan on building the subscriptions with me, you're going to want to have that Stripe customer ID along with the subscription. The session is a must if we're going to have the login. Here is the session. Remember, you can pause at any point and write all this down if you want to write it out by hand. The session is going to have that auth token that we spoke about. And then here is a relationship to the user. Just so it's clear, this user ID is the same as this. So this references this, and this ID references the user. The user ID here is the same as the user ID here. We could name this something different. We could call this customer ID. And now you see we get a squiggly line here. If we were to change that to customer ID, that would work as well. As long as these are the same and it knows what we're referring to, then it will work. I'll go ahead and leave that here as user ID. And we want to make sure that the user ID is unique. Also, we have subscriptions here. And as you can see, we have a relationship there as well. The Stripe ID for the subscription, we want that to be unique. The questions and answers, pretty straightforward. Notice here, as I talked about before, we have an author ID instead of just a user ID, but it references that same user ID as usual, but author makes more sense here than user. And then we have the answer, also author ID as well. We also need a relationship to the question because we want to know which question we're answering. So that's the entire schema for this application. You don't need anything else. So we already know that this file is empty. It's just going to be used as the database. Now we can look into the client.ts, and here we're just importing that Prisma client that we just installed, and we are making it available to the application. Now, if we were to run the migrations now, if we did npx prisma migrate dev, for example, we're going to get an error. Let's see that error. And the reason is it doesn't know where this schema is. Normally, it has a standard file path, which we did not use because I like this setup better. So we're going to need to tell Prisma where to find this schema file. And we do that by adding a value to the package.json, and we just tell Prisma that the schema is located here. And now when we run the migration, we'll actually get a migration. All the data will be lost. Let's say yes. We'll just call this dev. And now we have our migrations here. This is not a file that you ever need to touch. You just interact with it through the command line. And now we can run npx prisma studio. If you have some sort of other way to interact with your database or to view your database, it doesn't matter to me, but this is just one option. Since we already have Prisma installed, we can look at Prisma Studio. If we look here, we can see all of the tables, and right now they're all empty, but we're going to be working on filling those very shortly. You'll recall that in the register route, we were simply returning the hello from the API, so we could see that we had a working connection. Now we would like to flesh this thing out, and we'll start by importing send error. We'll see why in a second. And we're going to use the use body composable available already on H3. That is the server name. and we will get all of the values from the body that we passed in from the front end. And then we're going to check if that user already exists using the email and the username. And if that user does exist, we can break off right here. We'll create an error with a 422. We'll grab the message from the user exists check. Either its email already exists or username already exists, and we'll send that back to the front end to be processed. However, if the user does not exist, we will go ahead and encrypt the password using Bcrypt, which we'll install in a moment. And then we'll create a typed object so we can send that to a repository to create the user. Once we have that user, we can create a session for that user and send that back to the front end. Let's go ahead and install Bcrypt. We can do that by running yarn add Bcrypt. Once Bcrypt is installed, then we can add an import up here, simply adding Bcrypt from Bcrypt. We can also add this type here. We can import that as well. Now we're down to making the functions in order to check for the user, create the user, and make the session. Checking if a user already exists and creating a user should be done in something like either a user service or user repository. In this case, I'll create a user service for this function because we're going to not only retrieve something from the database, we're going to make a couple calls, then we're going to create a message that we can send back here. So we're going to have some processing after the initial database calls, so it would make sense to put that into a service. Now we want to create a services directory, and inside of that directory, we want to create a user service. For this user service, we're going to need a type of exists check. I'm not very creative with the names, and a registration errors type. We will return that exists check as a promise. I've commented out these two calls that we're going to make to the repository because we want to do a little in-between check to make sure that this is working as we expect it. So we want to have those registration errors. If the email exists, we're going to add the email error. This email already exists. The same for the username. And if either of those things are true, we are going to stringify those bad boys and send them back from this service. If everything is good and neither of those exist, we're just going to return back false that they don't exist. Let's check this out in the browser. If I make this call, we'll see we got the 422 response that we expect, and we got that email error, and we got the username error. Let's refactor this to actually check for the username and email. First, check this one. So if the email exists, we'll just say has email, and we're going to get a return back, and we want to check if that return is not null, then we want to say the email exists. The same thing for this username, and the same thing we want to say if it is not null, then we want to say that it exists. And we can leave the rest of that the same. We also want to make an import up here for two functions, these two functions here. We're going to do that from the server database repositories use repository, and we'll recreate that right now. Inside of here, we want to import Prisma. That is the client that we created earlier, and just the type of user. We are using Prisma to find a unique user with the email that we pass in. If it finds it, it will return the ID and username. If not, it will return null. The same thing with the username. We want to see if there is a user with this username, and it will return null as well. We already know from our earlier check that if it does exist, that the service will throw that error. So we don't need to check that again. And now let's check to see what happens when it doesn't exist. So we need to restart the server. All right, let's see what we get here. We get a 500, which is no longer that error. And the 500 probably is one of those missing functions. So create user is not defined. And that is exactly what we would expect. But it has gotten past this check now, and it has tried to create the user, which it cannot. So let's go ahead and create that create user function. Because we don't need to do any extra processing for this create user, we can do it directly in the user repository. We can add a function here for create user. We already know this user doesn't exist. We don't need to check that again. And we can just pass the values directly to the data property of this create function. Prisma will then create a user in the database and return that. Back here, we need to import this function up top like so. We can add here. Now make session is undefined, which means Prisma Studio, we should be able to actually view a user. Go to users. Here's our user. We can see that password has been encrypted. We now can save users to the database. We can get working on that session. All right, we'll begin making this make session service. So we'll call it session service by adding a few packages. We'll start with view use. Once that's installed, we want to add those types for the Bcrypt package that we just installed. Then we will add the UUID package along with those types. Now we can create a session service under the services directory, session service.ts. In this session service, we will add some imports. We're going to create this session repository with these functions shortly. We're going to use the user interface along with that UUID package that we just installed. We're going to add a function called make session. That's going to have the user and event as parameters, and we're going to return a type of user as a promise. For using this package, we're going to simply get a version 4 UUID, and we're going to replace all the dashes, so then we'll just have letters and numbers. We're going to use this create session function, which we'll create shortly, pass in the auth token and user ID. From there, we'll expect to get a session back, and we're going to check to make sure we have a user ID on that. And if we do, we will set a cookie. Two important things to note here. You can name the cookie whatever you like as long as you're consistent throughout the app. The path needs to be set to root so it's available everywhere in the application. And HTTP only needs to be set so the cookie can't be manipulated in front-end JavaScript, and will return a user from a session. If we don't create a session, then we'll throw an error. And this we have as a separate function so that we can call it independently. Once we have a token, we can just call this to get the user from the session. That is all we need for this. Now let's create that repository. We can just copy this here and come out and create the repository, add a TS at the end. In the repository, we will add our imports. Notice we're using the Prisma client here, the user type, and the session type. Then we're going to create a session. We're just passing those data that we received from the session service and creating the session in the database, and we're going to return that right away. We're also going to get session by auth token, which we also saw in the repository. And here we're going to get the user by the auth token, and we're simply returning that relationship down here. This is how you return a relationship from Prisma. That is all we need for this repository. Now we'll need to import that make session from the service. So we have make session here, and we'll have to import that in the register route here, like so. And now we can test it on the front end. All right, if I add some values here, now I'm being redirected to the dashboard as we expected. Also, I'm getting a 200, which means I already know that the session has been set. If we go to the cookies, we can actually see our auth token set here. We can see that the path is to root and it's HTTP only. Now we can move on to actually making sure that the user is shown. So here we are already logged in, but as you can see, we don't see a user. When we refresh, that user is now gone. Although we have this session token, it's still there. We need to add the functionality to make sure that we grab that user every time we refresh. Back in that use auth composable, let me adjust the formatting here so we can see everything. Now we can register, and we know that we are getting the user back, it's being set, and we are being pushed to the dashboard. But what we also need is for when we refresh for that user to be set as well. We want to add a function firstly to get that cookie. We can use this use cookie composable, and we're going to grab that auth token. Make sure if you named it something different that you're consistent. Then we're going to add a use user function, which will return a promise with the user as the type. And we'll use this cookie, and we're going to grab the value from that as the auth cookie. Then we're going to set the user state. It's going to also return a user. And we're going to see, is there an auth cookie? If yes, and the user value is not set, then we're going to make an API call, and we're going to fetch the user by the auth token, and we're going to pass along that cookie header. Then we're going to set the value to the user value to the data value we get from this fetch. And then we'll return the user value to this use user. Now we'll need to add this path. Just copy that here. And we'll go into the server and create this. We'll need to add a TS to that. And here we will add our imports. We'll create our event handler. We're going to return a type of user. We're going to get that auth token, and we're going to get the user by the token session. And we're just going to go ahead and return that user. Now we just need to add this type up here. While we're at it, let's go ahead and add a logout function. So user logout, and we'll hit the path of logout, and we'll set the user state to null, and then we will push to the index of, so the root of the application, which means we're going to need to create this route here under auth. We'll just add that route like that. And you'll see all we're doing is grabbing the event, and then we're going to set the cookie of auth token to null. So that means the cookie will also be set to null, not only the state of the user. Were we to leave this cookie as it was, the next time they hit refresh, they would be logged in again. So to prevent that, we'll set that cookie to null. Now in the nav bar, we have a user component here, which we will create now. I'll go over this with you. We will have a avatar. We're going to get the state of the user. We're importing that logout function. So this user logout function from that composable that we just created. The hide actions and user actions. And an on-click outside function. This on-click outside is from view use. If someone clicks outside of this user actions, then we're going to hide the value. And we'll see what this looks like in a second. In the actual UI. Here we are saying welcome to the user. When we click here on this image, they're going to have this avatar. Then there's going to be a pop-up, and that pop-up will just allow us to either log out, another action, and something else here. So you can fill those actions in with whatever you want. They're left as sort of placeholders, and the only thing we're going to actually be using is log out, and you'll see we have this click listener, which calls the logout function that we just created. Now, if we go to the app.view, let's add a script, and notice the setup and language tags. And then we're going to add a couple of imports. We're going to use the Nuxt app so that whenever we switch to a page, that we scroll to the top. I find that to be very nice, and you'll see why later in the video. And also right at the root of the app, we want to call this await use user, this composable that we have just built. And the reason for that is right at the entry of the app, we want the user to be set. So if somebody pushes refresh, we want that to be one of the very first things that happens when the app starts up. We could leave off the const part and it would still work. And let's see, perhaps we need to refresh or restart server. No, we don't. And now we see that we have our user set here. And when we click on that button, we have that logout button. I won't log out for now because I want to address a security point, which is right now, if we check the user, the state, Nuxt state user, you'll see that we're giving a little bit too much information here. Once we have a Stripe customer ID, we don't want to show that. We definitely don't want to show a password, even if it's encrypted. We'll work on getting that hidden right now. So if we open up the server and go to services, user service, we'll create a new function here. We'll call it sanitize user for the front end. We will accept a user or undefined as the input. And if we don't have a user, we're just going to return it, which will essentially be returning undefined. Then we're going to delete from this user all of the things we want to hide. We'll leave those for now, and we'll return that user. In the session service, we'll want to sanitize the user for the front end. Let's see if we can get that to import. Yes, sirree. Sanitize user for front end. And now if we refresh and check that again, we'll see that those values, we have the email. Yeah, all of those are okay to show on the front end. I'd like this to start looking pretty already, so I'm going to add some images. So here I'll just close everything up, and I will put my images in the, oh, we don't have that yet. I'll make a public directory, and inside of that public directory, I'll throw all my images in there in a images folder. So the image is being shown, here's the path. And I've mentioned this in previous videos. This is how you want your path to look for images that you place within this directory. So you have a public directory and an image. So whatever path it is, it starts at public. So public is essentially your root for images. Keep that in mind. Now, if I do a refresh, things are looking a little more beautiful. We obviously want to prevent people from coming here. So we'll add a guest middleware, and it'd be cool to have this image here on the side. I'll add it here. Notice I have the scale as 50 and hover scale is to 110. And notice the path as well. Starts root is public. So a refresh, it's already showing. And then we get that cool little effect here. It dawned on me that I didn't have any form validation, but I've since added it, and I'll quickly go over what it took to add form validation. I'm sure there are much easier ways to do it, but I'll just take 1 to 2 minutes to show you how I did it. If you don't want to add form validation this way, just go ahead and skip this and that would be fine. So for example, when I click the form now, if all the values are empty, we get the corresponding answers. If I add some values here, we'll see that this username is already registered. Password's got to be at least 8 characters, and Jack is not a valid email. Jack@jack.com. We can see now we've only got 2 errors. Call him Jackie. Now we've only got the 1 error. And now we are rerouted as expected. So what did it take to make this happen? We'll start here in the register form, register.view. I've made some changes as far as what we receive back and how we use that. For example, so for the response, I've actually typed it to a type called form validation. And to start, I have the has error set to false. So that way down here, has errors is set to false, which means that red box won't be showing up. Also, we can check out this has errors and errors is a map. The key is a string, and the value is a check with an input validation. And this is how that type looks. We have the key, the value. We see if it's blank. Some of them need a minimum of 8 characters. The password, for example, is the email taken, is the username taken, and we have an error message. So going back here. So in order to make this happen, let's go to the use auth register route. So now we're going to give back that form validation as we already saw. Now, when we make this request, instead of we had the $sign fetch, we had it like that. Instead of doing that, we're going to use fetch. And that way we get the data that comes back if it's normal and the error if not. If there is an error, I had to do a little, I don't know, we'll call it maneuvering with TypeScript here because I couldn't quite get TypeScript to stop screaming at me. There are surely better ways of doing it than I did, but I just created a dummy type here with just data inside so that I could type this to a string. And then I parse the errors and then I add them to a map. I do object entries. I add that result to a map and then I type it the same way that I typed it over here. So I have that same sort of typing. And then I just return the errors. So I return the error map in this. What the map allows us to do, which I think is pretty cool, is I can just say, for example, here, errors has, and then name. And then I can add this is a dynamic class. So it's only if this is true will this border be set. And we saw how that looks. So only the ones that have an error in it will be set with this border, which is pretty cool. And it makes a lot of sense, just say, hey, do the errors have a name? So that's pretty cool. And now let's take a look at the API. So if we go to the register route, so there's been a bit of change here. For starters, I added a data here. I added the data, which is the errors. If we're sending the errors, you can add data to it. I didn't find a better way to do it, but I think this works out pretty well. Also, we stringify a map. We have a map here. I tried to send the map directly to the front end, but that didn't work out. So I stringify it here, and basically I unstringify it there. I parse it there. So I do parse here, and then basically I have that stringified map to work within the front end, and then we return it back to a map. All right, so validate users. What changed here? I keep in mind, you can just check out the end of this section and you'll have the exact code that you can look at. I'm just trying to show you the highlights so we can keep this thing going. All right, so for validate user, instead of validating in the user service directly, I created a separate validator. And here's the other cool part. If there are errors, because this is a map, which I'll show you in a second, I can just say, what is the map size? If the map size is greater than 0, that means there is at least one error. That means we have an error. That means here, I definitely want to throw this error, because then I set has errors to true. That's here. So if the error size is greater than 0, then I set it to true and I pass along the errors. And that way I can add this simple check here to see, are there errors? If so, let's send them. So a map makes that pretty easy. So if we go to validate, this is a service called validator. Here's where we create that map. Initially, it's empty. We just add the types here. And then we loop through the data that we got from the front end. So this is that registration form with the username, email, password, and so on. We loop through this object, and for each entry, we run the checks. And if the check has an error, then we set. This is how you set on a map. It's essentially like pushing to an array if you're not familiar. And we just add the key, which we already have. We add the value, which we will create from this run check. And we add that to check. So the run check is pretty straightforward. So each key and value comes in. And so we require, in this particular form, every value to be there. So if it's blank, we're just going to break off early, return early, and say that it's required. If the key is less than 8 and it is a password, then we will say the password has to be at least 8 characters. As a matter of fact, we could switch this because this is the only one that has that rule. If not, we'll say that it's met the minimum length. If the key is an email, we're going to check if it's a valid email, and that's here at the bottom. We just do a little regex and we see if it is a valid email or not. Again, you can check that out on GitHub. If it's not valid, we'll just say it's not a valid email and we'll return early. We're only checking that if it's an email, obviously. If it is a valid email, then we want to take the time to do this database call to check, get user by email, as we've already done earlier. And of course, if that email is taken, we're going to break off here, or we're going to say that the email is taken. Same thing with the username, except we've already checked to see if it's blank, and now there is no extra requirement for the username. We can just test to see if it's taken, and if it is, we'll break off there. So that's essentially all of the validation. I know there's a million validation libraries out there, but this is how we're doing it here. To recap where we are, we can register like so. We're going to be sent to a blank dashboard at the moment, but we're going to fix that shortly. Once we are registered, we can also log back out. Now it would make sense if we created a login page once we registered, that we can log out and now we can log in. So let's get started on that. Under pages, we're going to create a login page, and I'll walk you through this login page. We're going to use a From this use auth composable, we're going to add a login function. Let's see, here's just a form that we're going to log in with, and we're going to pass that email and password. And on this form, we simply have a vModel binded email and password, along with some styling and a click listener to post the login form. And that is about it. Also, we're going to say that you must be a guest here. I guess now would be a good as time as any to add those middleware. So we have a guest and auth middleware. The guest middleware just simply sees if the user is a guest. So we're going to get the user, and if the user is not the same as null or undefined, then we're going to send them back to the index of the application, so the home page. The opposite here, if the user is null, we're going to send them to the home page. So that's it for, we can clean that up a little bit. So that's it for the middleware there. So back to the login page. Now we need to create in the auth composable, this use auth composable, we need to create the login with email function. Let's go to the use auth, and we'll add a function here. And for this login function, we are going to log in with email and password. We're going to do a fetch. Let me close that out. We're going to do a fetch, and we're going to pass a post with the email and password. And we're going to set the result to the user state. Then we're going to push to the dashboard the same as we did here in the register. Now we'll need to create this API auth login route. So under server, API, auth, let's create a login. So login.ts. Here we're going to add our imports. Notice the sanitize for your front end and Bcrypt. Also, we're going to get the user by email and be able to make a session. So we'll create that async, default async function. And here we're going to grab the body, and we're going to get the username and email off of that. And we're going to get the user by the email. If that user does not exist, we're going to just go ahead and say it's unauthenticated. And then we're going to use Bcrypt to compare the passwords. And if the passwords are the same, or sorry, if the passwords are incorrect, then we're going to also send back authenticated. Otherwise, we're going to make a session, and then we're going to grab the user and we're going to sanitize it for the front end. And that is all we need to be able to log in. So after restarting the server, let's see what's going on here. All right, so it turns out there is a unique constraint failure, and that is here on the session. We're here in the schema.prisma. On the session, I have a unique for user ID. So I can go ahead and remove that, and then I'll need to run the migrations again. Let's see. References user ID. And if I do that, then apparently I need to make it a one-to-many, which I believe I can do just by adding a array here. Let's try that again. All right, we'll call it dev. And now everything seems to be in order. So let me try this again. Perhaps I need, I stopped the server. All right, moment of truth. Oh, shabam. Now we can log in. We are sent to this empty dashboard. All right, that about covers it for the authentication. I think that's a good stopping point for the first video. Let me know if you want to see more in the comments below. I'll see you in the next one.